Psalm 130 tonight. Psalm 130. So let me say to you as we get into this psalm, if you're interested in really good music, the Gettys have a version of Psalm 130 that actually I made the executive decision today. I'm going to make that the next song that we learn. It's called "I Will Wait for You," and you'll see why. It's a supplication hymn. It's a supplication psalm, and we're actually starting Sunday, we're going through prayers in the Scriptures. We're just going to do adoration prayers, confession prayers, thanksgiving prayers, and supplication prayers in the Scriptures, bringing us into Thanksgiving, and then we're going to do Thanksgiving and Christmas sermons to take us through the end of the year. So I think for that supplication, he doesn't know this yet. Okay, so you all can hold his feet to the fire. But I think for the Sunday that we do supplication prayers, we're going to learn this song. Okay, again, Brandon doesn't know that yet, but he's going to find out tomorrow. Maybe some of you know this song already, but you will see why it is called "I Will Wait for You." But truly, it is. They did a great job with it, and so not only can we learn a supplication hymn that day, but we can learn a psalm. And you've heard me say it's one of our goals to learn psalm-based hymns together. So as I was studying the psalm, Psalm 130, continuing the Ascent songs, I was reminded of a video that I saw recently, and it was posted to I'm a part of a pastor's page on Facebook that's huge. There's a bunch of pastors in it, and someone posted it and said, "This reminds me of pastoral ministry." And I saw it, and I thought, it just reminds me of myself. And it was a video of a shepherd, and he yanked a sheep out of a ditch. There was this little mud ditch, and it was clearly they were at a farm, and the sheep had fallen face first in the ditch. And so even when it was bleeding, you couldn't really hear it, because the sound was completely muffled. So the shepherd knew where it was, and he goes and he grabs the sheep and he rips it out. And can you think of what the sheep does next? Sheep takes about 3 jumps and jumps right back into the ditch. I mean, face first, just plugs in the ditch again. So the shepherd goes and rips him out of the ditch and helps the sheep. Now again, someone very comically put that on this pastor's page and said, "This reminds me of pastoral ministry." And to a certain extent, you can empathize. I can empathize with that. But again, my thought was that reminds me of myself. There are a number of low points in my life that if I look back, I can think of reasons why I got there. I was responsible for that low point in some particular situation. But there are other times in my life when I look back at low points where that low point was inflicted upon me. It was maybe someone else's sin or someone else's wrong. It was not a ditch I put myself in. It was a ditch I was left in. And I'm sure you can think of times in your life where you feel the exact same way. You think of low points in your life that either you were responsible for, or just to be realistic and fair about the situation, someone else was responsible for it. And as you think about the low points in your life, this psalm is a text for people at low points in their life. Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than the watchman for the morning, more than the watchman for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Would you pray with me? Father, I pray that you would use this text to encourage us. You would use this text to have a high view of you, a thankful heart, a rejoicing spirit, a pure heart, pure hands, pure minds. And I pray that you would use this text for the purposes that you have in this evening and this time, knowing that you sovereignly ordain the moment that the word is preached to the people. And I ask these things through Christ. Amen. Well, if you note the structure of the psalm, it's almost like there's this upward trajectory to the psalm. It starts low and it ends high. And you'll kind of see that progression as we go along. So in order to see that, obviously we start low. If you look at me in verses 1 and 2, at the cry from the depths, a cry from the depths. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. This phrase, depths, is commonly understood as from deep waters. It was understood that way culturally, but here it clearly has the implication of emotional depths, circumstantial depths, difficult times. Out of despair, I cry to you. So if you note, the cry from the depths is first of all a cry for attention from the Lord, a cry for attention. This is a good cry for attention. You know, sometimes when we say that there's a cry for attention, we usually mean the bad thing. Maybe somebody's acting out, or your children says something dramatic, or whatever. This is a good cry for attention. We're to always be desiring the attention of the Lord, the ears of the Lord. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. So the desire is that he be heard, and then this anthropomorphism, or human attribute given to God, is used in the second line of verse 2. Let your ears be attentive to me. You understand God's a spirit, doesn't have a body. God the Father doesn't likely have ears. Jesus obviously does, but the desire is that he be heard. Pay attention to me. I'm at this desperate time. Things are really bad. I'm feeling really low. Give me your attention. Give me your ears. Maybe there have been times in your life where you've really felt like you didn't have God's ear. The prayer stopped at the ceiling. And then he cries for mercy. There's a cry for attention, a good attention from Yahweh, and a cry for mercy. And I will say this about the depths of our life. There are times, and even as we introduced, there are times when the difficulties in our life are not a direct result of our sin. But when difficulty comes, there should be an immediate introspection. There should at least be an inclination to go before the Father, to go before God, and look inward, to see if there be any wicked way in us, to ask for his withholding of discipline or a withholding of a difficult circumstance, that God would show his mercy. So, whether this situation is one of a direct result of sin, he's feeling the judgment or the discipline of the Lord, or perhaps he's feeling the judgment, perhaps he's feeling difficult circumstances from enemies, his desire is still that he know the mercy of the Lord. Perhaps you find yourself recognizing that in this time, in this evening, on Wednesday, October 25th, that this text really is for you. Because you are at a low point in your life. You are in the depths. Remember, I said that the implicit meaning here is the depths of deep waters. So perhaps you are emotionally drowning, circumstantially drowning. Have you gone to the Lord and asked for His fullest gaze? That you would sit pure before Him. That you would be honest with your struggles, and that He would incline His ear like a loving father getting on one knee before his children, to listen to them, to hear them at their level. And you've gone to Him asking for mercy with a spirit of introspection. Search me and know me and see if there be any wicked way in me. Life is full of highs and it's full of lows. But one thing that we're just constantly aware of in this life is that only the new heavens and new earth is going to be full of highs. That's what awaits us. That's not where we are now. But if we're growing in our faith, the ideal is that as we get closer to God, the lows become more meaningful, and we're taught more by them. So perhaps you need this text especially so that you may cry from the depths. And then the psalmist, with this desire for mercy, he's going to really lean into this idea of needing the mercy of God. And he's going to draw comfort from the reality that he will receive that mercy. So he cries from the depths for attention and for mercy. And then he asks a question of deliverance. How is he going to be delivered from the depths? Well, it's going to be the grace of the Lord. And where do we fully see this grace? He talks about, in the end of verse 2, he desires the mercy of the Lord, and then he meditates on the grace of the Lord. Verse 3, if you should mark my iniquities, and here's the question, O Lord, who could stand? If you should mark the iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? This word mark has the idea of a written record. It literally has the idea of to mark something down. So what the psalmist is implying is, if you were to take notes on my guilt, if you were to keep a track record of my guilt, then how could anybody stand? Like Psalm 1, how do we stand in the congregation of the righteous rather than the congregation of the sinners? Well, it's the mercy of the Lord. So the question is, how can sinners stand? And it's a question we all must face. And it's a question, of course, if we're one of God's children, then we've already encountered and we already have an educated and devotional and spiritual answer for. And the answer is through full forgiveness. The question is, how can sinners stand? Verse 3. And the answer, verse 4, is through full forgiveness. The only way we stand in the congregation of the righteous is if our sins are forgiven. And I love verses 3 and 4. Verses 3 and 4 are like an Old Testament form of Ephesians 2. If you were to mark the iniquities of mankind, no one would stand, but with you there is forgiveness. We were dead in our trespasses and sins, but God, who is rich in mercy, loved us with a great love. And note what he says in verse 4 about God's forgiveness. We tend to be, and I don't think we do this on purpose, but maybe I should say it this way, we can become self-centric in our view of God's forgiveness. Well, I'm thankful for the benefits of God's forgiveness. God's forgiveness is for me. God's benefit, or the benefit of God's forgiveness is primarily for me. And that's true if we're talking about who it primarily benefits on a grace perspective. But note what the psalmist says. But with you there is forgiveness. Here's the reason, that you may be feared. So where does the psalmist reflect the glory of forgiveness? Back to the person of God. If you question, should mark the iniquities of mankind, no one could stand. This is a rhetorical question. Oh Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, the release of sin, the release of guilt, the expunging of that record, that you may be honored, that you may be reverenced. Us rightly understanding forgiveness increases a reverence and fear for God. And you of course understand when it says here, when we're talking about fear, it's talking about a reverential honor, not some sort of terror. It's the same kind of fear in the Song of Ascent, Psalm 128. Blessed or happy is everyone who fears the Lord. Happy is everyone who fears. So it must be a good fear, not a bad fear, because if you have bad fear, you're not happy. Same fear. But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. And of course, we understand this from a new covenant perspective. What this looks like in our life is just rejoicing in the gospel. Rightly understanding what God through Christ has done for us, that it may increase our propensity to glorify Him and our capacity to worship Him. Why should we desire God's forgiveness? That we may know His goodness. And why should we desire God's forgiveness? That we may give Him glory. So let's make sure as we think about forgiveness that it's rightly balanced and it's not accidentally self-centric. Well, I'm so thankful for God's forgiveness for me. We should be primarily thankful for God's forgiveness for God, because He is worthy of that glory. And the greater I understand His forgiveness, the greater I will then revel in that grace and reflect the glory that He rightfully deserves. How can sinners stand? Only through the faultless One standing on our behalf and imputing to us His righteousness, that we may stand in the congregation of the righteous. And then you'll note with me, just to be very practical in verses 5 and 6, you say, well, I am feeling in a depth. How do we respond when we're in the depths? We respond with a cry for the Lord's attention. We respond introspectively, desiring His mercy. We meditate on the goodness of the gospel and the glory of forgiveness. And we make certain our confidence is where it should be. And so note with me in verses 5 through 6, the confidence of the desperate, or the despairing, or those in the depths. What's the confidence? Verse 5, wait for the Lord. My soul waits. Repeated in verse 6, my soul waits for the Lord. And then more than the watchman of the morning. Repeated, more than the watchman for the morning. So our confidence must derive from waiting on the Lord. Waiting on the Lord. This is something we've talked constantly throughout the Psalms, because we see this concept of waiting on the Lord in the text. I was studying this phrase even deeper today, and one Bible dictionary brought up an ancient understanding of this idea of waiting being understood in synonymously with some sort of tension. is forgiveness. That when we ask, it will be given, and it will ultimately be given. And you have to understand this from the framework that this writer meant it. You say, who's the writer? I don't know. The Song of Ascents, we'll meet him in the new heavens one day. Maybe. I doubt he'll be bragging about it. Yeah, I wrote Psalm 130. Be awesome, though, right? That's the kind of stuff that'll happen in the new heavens. But he doesn't know how ultimate redemption and forgiveness is going to be accomplished. He just trusts that it will be. And so let's take the same principle and apply it to where you are, because you and I do know ultimately how forgiveness and redemption is accomplished. But there's a lot of things that we don't know how that tension will be resolved. Can I just back up and ask this question? What tension in your life is not resolved by ultimate redemption in Christ? The cross is the resolution of every human tension. The cross lifted up lifts up every one of God's children in the depths. And then the psalmist is going to use a poetic image for safety. And again. The psalmist starts in the depths, and he steps out confidently, just pulling himself out a little bit higher to beg for the Lord's attention and for mercy. And he stands a little bit higher. Maybe he's on his knees now, coming out of the depths, remembering the promise of redemption and waiting and hoping in it. And now he's standing, waiting confidently on the Lord because of the Scriptures and the promises given in the Word. And now he stands before the congregation Israel. He goes from the depths to leading the choir. O Israel, verse 7, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with Him is bountiful, plentiful redemption. And He will redeem Israel and all Israel's iniquities. So the confident assertion of waiting in verse 5 becomes an absolute assertion of belief in verse 7. He will redeem, because He's plenteous in redemption. And verse 8, He will save His people from their sins. And so we find in verses 7 and 8 the call to the delivered. Call to the delivered. Sing of the redemption, Israel. Sing of our future forgiveness. Wait on Him, endure, and rejoice in these promises. And how can you do this? It can only happen if you know the promises and you're waiting in the Word, you're waiting in the Lord, knowing the promises and hoping confidently in the Scriptures. And then we will tell of the salvation of the Lord. But how is there plenteous redemption in Him? I want you to think about the psalm in terms of the incarnation. Christ coming to the depths, that we may be raised to the heights. To put it in C.S. Lewis terms, as he thinks about the depths of the incarnation, I love how he pictures this, because he presses into the image of Jesus really not coming to a nice place in contrast to where He came from. One may think of a diver first reducing himself to nakedness, then glancing in midair and gone with a splash, vanished, rushing down through green and warm water into black and cold water, down through increasing pressure into the death-like region of ooze and slime and old decay. Then up again, back to color and light, his lungs almost bursting, till suddenly he breaks surface again, holding in his hand the dripping, precious thing that he went down to recover. Christ to the depths, that we may be brought to the heights. This is plenteous redemption, for which the writer of Psalm 130 waited, and now we fully know. The psalm teaches us that our deepest guilt before God, our deepest guilt is before God, but our greatest hope is the grace of God. Our deepest problem is guilt before God, but our greatest hope is the grace of God. Plenteous redemption in the person and work of Christ. Loved one, what low of your life can your Savior not possibly pull you from? Because if He has rescued us from sin, He's sufficient to raise us from any plight.